The year was 1915, and the world was already drowning in the chaos of the First World War. But far from the trenches of Europe, another war was being waged. Not with armies facing each other on battlefields, but with an empire turning on its own people. In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, a Christian minority whose ancestors had lived in the region for millennia, became targets of a meticulously planned annihilation. For generations, Armenians had been farmers, artisans, and scholars in the empire's eastern provinces. They spoke their own language, kept their faith, and nurtured their traditions. But in the eyes of the Ottoman rulers, especially the radical nationalists who rose to power during the war, this identity made them dangerous. Paranoia was dressed as patriotism. The ruling Committee of Union and Progress claimed the Armenians were plotting with Russia, the empire's enemy, and in the shadows of this accusation, they found their excuse. It began with whispers and curfews. Men were taken from their homes in the night, told they were being drafted into labor battalions, only to be led to remote fields where they were executed. Intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders were rounded up in the capital on a spring night in April 1915. This was not random violence. It was the first blow in a calculated plan. Then came the deportations. Women, children, and the elderly were forced from their homes, allowed only what they could carry. Ottoman soldiers and hired gangs drove them into the deserts of Syria and Mesopotamia. There were no maps, no shelters, and no supplies. Food and water became luxuries. Thousands collapsed under the sun. Thousands more were massacred along the route. Rivers ran with bodies. Villages became ghost towns overnight. Witnesses, foreign diplomats, missionaries, and even some Ottoman officials sent urgent reports to the outside world. The American ambassador, Henry Morgenthau Sr., wrote that it was a campaign of race extermination. But the world was distracted. Europe was locked in a global war, and leaders weighed political alliances over human lives. Newspapers printed the stories, but governments looked away. For the Armenians who survived, the desert was not the end, but another stage of suffering. Camps became prisons without walls. Starvation and disease claimed those the swords had spared. And still, no nation intervened. The silence was deafening, and it told the Ottoman rulers that the world would not stop them. This was a Holocaust before the word even existed. A systematic destruction of a people. An estimated 1.5 million Armenians were killed. A civilization shattered. And yet, even in the darkest days, there were flickers of courage. Mothers hid children in friendly Kurdish villages. Priests smuggled relics and manuscripts through the mountains. Survivors carried with them the songs, the stories, and the stubborn hope that their culture would not vanish. The aftermath of the Armenian Genocide was not a moment of reckoning, but of erasure. The Ottoman Empire fell, but the new Turkish Republic denied that a genocide had occurred. The bones of the dead lay in unmarked graves, and their memory was pushed into silence. Entire towns once filled with Armenian voices were resettled, their churches converted into warehouses or left to crumble. For the survivors scattered across the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas, exile became the only home they knew. In Beirut, Aleppo, Marseille, and Fresno, they rebuilt communities from ashes. They taught their children the Armenian language as an act of defiance. They baked bread in clay ovens and embroidered the patterns their grandmothers had taught them. turning every stitch into a memorial. But silence has a way of shaping history. For decades, the genocide remained a whispered truth, passed down in family kitchens rather than in classrooms. International politics played its part. Turkey's strategic location made it a valuable ally for the West during the Cold War, and few nations dared to confront the past openly. Recognition of the genocide was sacrificed for military bases and trade agreements. This silence carries an uncomfortable echo for other peoples who have suffered, especially those whose histories of persecution have been buried or denied. African diasporic communities understand this wound deeply. From the Atlantic slave trade to colonial massacres across the continent, millions were stripped not only of their lives but of the acknowledgement of their suffering, just as the Armenians were painted as traitors to justify their destruction. Black communities have been dehumanized to justify centuries of exploitation. Yet, history is not only about victimhood, it is also about resilience. The Armenian diaspora did more than survive, it thrived, contributing art, literature, music, and political thought to their new homelands. Figures like Arshil Gorky, whose haunting paintings carried the shadows of his childhood trauma, and William Sboyan, whose words immortalized the stubborn joy of his people, turned grief into creation. And still, a question lingered. If the world had acted in 1915, if the cries of the Armenians had been met with justice, would later genocides, the Holocaust of the Jews, the slaughter in Rwanda, the ethnic cleansings in the Balkans, have been prevented? The historian's answer is chilling. Adolf Hitler himself, in planning his invasion of Poland, is recorded as saying, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" The silence of the world had set a precedent. What was denied became a blueprint for future atrocities. The Armenian Genocide was not only a crime against one people, but a lesson to oppressors everywhere, that the destruction of a culture could be carried out in plain sight, if the world chose not to see. Today, more than a century later, the struggle for recognition continues. Many nations now officially acknowledge the Armenian Genocide, yet Turkey's government still refuses to use the word. The politics of denial run deep, built on the fear that acknowledgement might lead to reparations or a rewriting of national identity. But truth has a way of breaking through, carried by the voices of descendants who refuse to let their ancestors be forgotten. Across the Armenian diaspora, memorials rise, stone cars carved with intricate crosses, their weathered faces telling a story the world once tried to silence. Each April 24th, thousands gather to march, holding portraits of the lost. The names of towns wiped from the map are spoken aloud, like prayers. In telling this story, we do more than remember the Armenians. We challenge the very mechanisms that allow such crimes to happen. We confront the comfortable lie that genocide belongs to the past. And we connect it to the struggles of other peoples, to the children of Africa whose ancestors endured the Middle Passage, to the survivors of apartheid and Jim Crow, to the descendants of indigenous nations whose lands were stolen. The thread that runs through all these histories is the danger of forgetting. When history is denied, it repeats. The Armenian Genocide teaches us that silence is complicity, and that the fight for justice must outlast the headlines. It shows us that dignity can survive even in exile, that a culture can be reborn from scattered seeds. And it calls us, here and now, to decide which side of history we will stand on when injustice demands our voice. The survivors of 1915 carried their memories like sacred fire. They told their children not just of the horrors, but of the songs sung on the march to the desert, the neighbors who risked everything to help, the fragments of beauty salvaged from ruin. In doing so, they passed on more than grief. They passed on pride, courage, and a belief that identity is not given by governments, but lived in the heart. History is not only what is written in books, it is what we choose to carry forward. The forgotten Holocaust that killed millions before Hitler is not forgotten to those who still bear its scars. And when we speak of it, we light a candle against the darkness, one that can guide us away from repeating the same mistakes, toward a world where memory is not a weapon, but a shield.